Wiley.
Hi, Claire. Hello.
Hello, it's so good to see you.
It's good to see you too. That was a great little intro music. Is that like a copyright a sweet tea thing?
Yep, our incredible composer Owen Eddy wrote that for us, and then there's a little infographic that plays, and it's a jam. I always dance when
Oh,
it comes
great.
on. Yeah,
I love that. That was a great way in.
it will also play us out, so it won't be the last time you hear
Okay. There.
it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So for anyone out there listening, thanks so much for being with us. My name is Claire Martin, and I'm the Assistant Artistic Director of Sweet Tea Shakespeare. And I am just overjoyed to be joined today by my dear friend and colleague, Wiley Gorn. So Wiley is he is a director, a dramaturg, a text coach, a teaching artist, an actor. He is, as we just talked about in our cocktail hour, he is the full package, a multidisciplinary artist,
Oh,
a absolutely profound depth and breadth of knowledge when it comes to Shakespeare. He specializes in heightened text, and particularly in helping actors sort of connect emotionally to heightened text, which is such a powerful thing and so important in making Shakespeare sort of come alive for audiences and to really let the language live in actors' bodies. So I've known him for a couple of years now, was fortunate enough to meet thanks to a brilliant mutual colleague, Chevy Chung. And yes, hello, Chevy, we love you. And Wiley sort of Seattle-based, so we're close to each other in the Pacific Northwest, and has worked with Seattle Shakespeare Company, with Upstart Crow Collective, which is an all-women and non-binary classical theater company that's based out of Seattle, and the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, among other theaters. So today we're gonna chat. We're gonna chat Shakespeare. We're gonna talk about text. We may even read some, and and mostly we're gonna talk about sort of a shared passion that connects the two of us, which is Shakespeare's history plays. The genre that is perhaps kind of least known in the common consciousness, but perhaps most applicable to the world and especially the America that we're living in today. So yeah, Wiley, thanks for being here.
yeah. This is great. This is a great little setup that we got. And I also I gotta say I really like the name Sweet Tea Shakespeare Company. It's really great. I went to school in North Carolina, and I'm a big fan of sweet tea. Although it's been a while since I've had what I would consider to be very like authentic North Carolina sweet tea. It was always my roommate in school, or I remember one of the first times we met, I was at his place, and he just had this huge pitcher in his fridge that he was pouring from. So it's that holds a very special place in my heart. So happy to be here.
I had forgotten.
Yeah.
I had forgotten you went to undergrad in North Carolina.
I did. I did. North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, home of the Fighting Pickles. That was our mascot. It
Sounds
was a great
fearsome.
place. We were very fearsome. You can look it up, Fighting Pickles. I'm telling the truth. The mascot is a pickle that is wearing a tutu that's made out of piano keys and has a little mustache and a little goatee, a mask on, a little floppy hat, and in one hand it's holding a film camera, and in the other one is a paintbrush, and it's sort of got like a fencing position.
Wow.
So we were the Fighting Pickles.
So what would that be, a Renaissance pickle?
It was a Renaissance pickle. You were pickles a thing? That's got to be a thing
Yeah,
in the Renaissance, right?
probably. I mean,
Yeah,
I just think of everything as being pickled, including the people.
absolutely. Yeah. You really any form of water you could probably pickle something in
Yeah.
back then. But yeah, North Carolina is hold a very very special place in my heart. That's very connected to just to youth and creativity and yeah, it's a good place. And sweet tea reigns supreme.
Fantastic. Well, we just cocktail hour with a friend of mine named Emily Garrison, who has also had authentic
Ah,
sweet tea, and I never have. And I was told that there is something very specific about the way it is brewed and made. It's
yes.
apparently
Yeah, it's
taken very
simple.
seriously.
There's a simplicity to it that I really appreciate. It's not too much. It can't be too sweet. Yeah, right, right. I'll be honest. I have no idea how to make it, nor have I ever tried.
Sure.
But yeah, there's a very you got to be in the pocket with the sweet tea. So it's special. It's a real thing. Sweet tea and cheerwine is another North Carolina thing that I didn't know about. Cheerwine.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to experiencing
Anyway,
all of these things. I'll probably tap you before I move. I'll be like, what are all of the specific like cultural nuances I'm going to need to know before I go there?
going to be, yeah, definitely asking someone who's not from North Carolina what those cultural nuances are. Perfect. No,
Take
yeah,
what I can get.
but yeah, North Carolina School of the Arts had a very foundational. I mean, that was just where I think every artist can trace to that watershed moment where you see a production or you get in a
Yes.
room with someone and the way that they approach the work kind of changes the way you experience it, and you feel like you really grow as a person and as an artist, and that I really associate a lot of North Carolina with that, and all the residual growth that has happened in the 8 years since I left. I also think all of that is connected back to that institution and the groundwork that they laid
Mhm.
for picking up new skills and developing new ideas and just a way to engage with the world.
That's awesome. So, did you have a watershed moment, and if so, what was it?
Well, I'll never forget the first production that I ever saw at that school when I was just I was 18 going down to visit. It was a production of Scapino,
Mm.
this Italian comedy, but it was all done with red noses. It was a red nosed clown Scapino,
Whoa.
and it was so yeah, I'd never experienced any show like that.
Hmm.
It was so specific to the world that it was in. It was in such a small, little, intimate space. It was so funny, and it was just alive in a way that I was completely unprepared for. Yeah, that was definitely the moment where I was like, "Oh, this is the place I got to go." But then, being there, I mean, it was the teachers that had amassed the learner was ace that school at that time. I've gone through a lot of changes. I've been in touch with a few folks who are teachers there now, and it's a really incredible institution. Oop, decline that. I got another call. Sorry about that. This is what happens working off a phone. Yeah, but the academic structure, the way they structured the education, um, uh, it just really focused on. It was all based on our individual growth. There was a very clear progression to at which point in the training do you start working on language? At which point in the training, okay, you started working on language, and at which point do you start working on Shakespeare? There was a
Mm.
great, there's just an inherent growth built into how they structured the work. So all the classes fed one into another, and you realize that the way I throw a punch in stage combat is exactly the same as how I pursue an action in acting class, or the uh, like releasing myself into some movement improv is the same thing as the release of sound in a voice class.
Yeah.
And that sort of collective understanding of, oh my God, all these pieces are coming together into this one thing. It's just a really masterful way that the program was structured that I continue to discover and learn new things about my own education years out, which is very exciting.
That's great.
And that was definitely, I mean, Shakespeare had always been a very big part of my life and a big draw to theater, but that was the place where I really got to sort of sit down and be with the language and the plays in a more uh, structured way than I had before.
Yeah.
And that was really exciting. I think that shifted just my connection with the language, but also just um, where I fit in on the chain of being within the spectrum
Sure.
of working with Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And I think we did a lot of great exercises about that Elizabethan, the cosmic chain of being.
Mm-hmm.
Everything
Oh, sure.
in the entire universe is on this chain of being. There's a wonderful exercise that we would do when we were all third. You don't work on Shakespeare really until your third year. That's when you spend this entire year developing this understanding and affinity for it that always begins with, what do I personally connect to? And there's a great exercise we did with our monologues. We're each assigned a different monologue, and knowing our characters and knowing the givens, our teacher had us line up and place ourselves on the great chain of being as to where we believed we were. So, like,
cool.
if you were a king, you were definitely at this part of the line. If maybe you're a lord, and it goes all the way down the line. And of course, if you're a bastard, she was like, okay, go stand outside the room. That's where you are on this great chain of being. And it was great. It was just a wonderful physical, visual representation of the impact of these stories. And that's just one of them. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So who were you? What was your monologue?
My monologue was from Richard II. Let's talk of graves, of worms, and epitaphs. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. That was my first. I think I had seen Richard II once or twice previously, but that was the first time I spent some time with that play and that character. And I completely acknowledge that I had no idea what that was at 21 or something, working in that. But I tried to use my own personal experience to connect to it, and I love that speech very much. I love the
beautiful.
I love the. Yeah, it's so beautiful, and I love that's another speech that has great natural stage directions.
Yeah.
Of if you look on, like, oh, what can I as an actor gain from the text? You look at what they're saying. Let's sit upon the ground. Oh, cover your heads.
Yeah, right.
Totally. Yeah. But I worked on Richard II, and that was in our voice class. All the Shakespeare work went hand in hand with our voice work. So for a while now, Shakespeare has been very connected in to voice work for me. And when I say voice work, I mean self-expression, because I do think that's what voice work is. I think the work that we do on our voices contributes to us being more expansive and better people, as opposed to just better actors.
Yeah.
And that Shakespeare could be a tool for my own growth and discovery was a really exciting thing to discover, and something that I've tried just to keep alive in every time I work on one of those plays.
Oh, that's marvelous. Well, I had this question for sort of tucked away for later in the conversation, but since you're sort of guiding us there already, I'll ask right now. I mean, what roles in the works are you particularly drawn to? Whether it's as an actor, dramaturg, text coach, director, or some combination of those, like, what roles really draw you in?
For sure, absolutely. Rosalind has always been a really big draw for me. Partially because so much of her work is in prose.
Yep.
And there's sort of a free form chaotic energy with prose that I really love.
Same.
And Rosalind, and I'd say Rosalind was also definitely like an early Shakespeare crush of mine, for sure.
Totally.
Yeah. Rosalind. Feste has always had a big impact and
Okay.
pull on me, specifically because of the melancholy nature, because he feels so he's integral, but he also feels very outside of
Mhm.
the whole story within
Yeah.
Twelfth Night. Um, yeah, and also that's my favorite of the plays for sure.
12th.
Um, yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of characters in Twelfth Night that I absolutely love, and okay, so director, text, dramaturgy. There are certain scenes that I find myself very
Okay.
drawn to and
Great.
connected with, and one five in Twelfth Night is definitely one of them. It's where we first meet
Take away the
Olivia, we
pool.
first meet Feste. Yeah, that whole exchange, helping someone through grief
Yeah.
and really speaking about grief and trauma and what it
Yes.
means to let that go, or not let that go, but just like what it means to live with it. There's a lot of language around acceptance and the duality of life, and that uh, suffering and joy can go hand in hand. And then the shift over from that into the Olivia Viola encounter,
Hmm.
which is just one of my favorites. Textually, I love when characters shift between verse and prose, or prose to
Yep.
verse. I think that tells us a lot about the moment. And I love also that there's no hard and set rule about that, right? It's specific to each circumstance, each character, and each play,
Yes.
why they might shift like
Yep.
that. I led a little workshop on unpacking prose, and one of the first things I came up against was like, as soon as you set rules, you got to throw them out the window. But so yeah, that scene definitely textually, the way it shifts from verse to prose. Um, it's so interesting. I really don't consider myself to be an actor with a lot of this stuff.
That's fair.
So when you said, what draws you as an actor, I don't know. I mean, lately Midsummer has been on my mind a
Okay.
lot. Uh, and in Midsummer, the mechanicals and Bottom, I absolutely love
More
that
prose.
arc, that journey. A lot more prose,
Yeah.
a lot of prose. And like there's something very naturalistic about those
Yeah.
prose also.
Hmm.
uh and I'm so curious at the productions of Midsummer that I see, again, when the actors are really able to bring themselves, because especially with the mechanicals, we're talking about things that, um for artists and theater people, it's very easy for us to connect the dots
Yeah.
and go, oh my gosh, that's just like me. So I'm always so excited when I see a company really relax into the similarities,
Sure.
as opposed to try and force it and find the bits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, other ones. Um, I've been having a great time looking over Richard II. That's the most recent play that I've been taking a look
Me
at,
too.
which I know
Yep.
you love so
I
much.
love
Yeah,
it.
there's something. It's there. His language and articulation throughout is really exciting to
Yeah.
look at, especially as the play goes on. Right?
Yes.
He's
Absolutely.
he something cracks open as it goes on.
That's such a,
That's
yeah,
been
evocative way of putting it. Yeah.
really, really cool. Yeah. Um, gosh. And then uh, Hamlet is always going to have some draw, um, because there's an actor writer that I've been working with for a few years now on. We've been crafting an adaptation of Hamlet that is reflective of their life story as well. So my mind's been very much in that,
Sure.
as with the director dramaturg brain on of, okay, what's going on in that story,
Yeah.
and what's going on in the story that we're trying to tell, and where do those two meet, and where do they overlap, where does one overtake the other. That's something, the idea of like ourselves overtaking Shakespeare is something I've been really interested in.
Yeah.
Is when the language in the story becomes a vehicle truly for the humans telling it. When we can see and be aware of the work that's going on behind the story that we think we came to see,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
There's just yeah. Anytime we do these plays, anytime we're talking about Shakespeare, I think on some level we're always really talking about ourselves. Um, and I like seeing the self come through in little
Mhm.
moments, which it folds back into the voice work. That's why I think Shakespeare is such a great uh, tool to utilize when you're doing voice work because the level of articulation, the level of emotional articulation and
Sure.
emotional nuance that you can find simply in the sound of some of those
Yeah.
words is a great thing to be able to release feelings and emotions onto that we may not have words for. Um, I may not be able to fully articulate myself and my feelings, but if I'm given a little a little bit of Romeo to go with, then oh my God, that's exactly what it feels like for me,
Hmm.
which is very exciting. So yeah,
I love that. And I know from experience, as someone who struggles with emotional vulnerability and like struggles to open up to people and struggles to trust people,
mm,
I have found salvation in so much of Shakespeare because I feel like it puts words on the emotions that I don't want to touch with my own words, or I'm like I the things that I can't articulate. It gives me a way to convey those feelings in
yeah,
almost in a safe environment. Like it's almost like his words create a safe conduit for me to channel my
mm,
emotion through. And I think that's a very personal version of what we think of a theater doing for us, like socio-politically, right? Like a theater is a safe place, a safe conduit for us to ask really scary questions and challenge existing paradigms. But it's like a safe environment to do it in. And I feel like
absolutely.
Shakespeare's language is like a safe environment for me to release really, really deeply felt emotions.
Yeah, I love that. I love the image of a conduit. I always think of it like a riverbed
Mm,
that has no water in it, and you are the water. The actors are the
hmm.
water. The performance is the water, and it's got a set course that it's going to go on, and that's the story. That's the language.
Yeah,
But how you fill it is totally up to you.
right.
You may one day it may be rapids and you just blow through the whole thing, or it might be the big lazy river, these like slow, still, deep waters. But yeah, it is a channel. It is a conduit. And I'd go so far as to say that any form of heightened text
Yep.
has the potential
Oh yeah.
to do that. And I'm always interested with Shakespeare. It's like, what if Shakespeare especially is becomes a bit of a doorway to find other writers that do that same thing for us.
Yeah.
I think that can be a great opportunity to continue to learn more about the world and the people who are writing plays in a heightened text that are out there right now.
Yep. I mean,
Yeah,
Shakespeare was my gateway to restoration drama and restoration comedy.
yeah,
It's actually where my heart lives. Actually, like I've read a lot of Shakespeare's contemporaries, but I don't connect to most of
that's
them.
not.
With
Yeah,
with a
yeah,
few notable exceptions. Like I love Duchess of Malfi, I love Edward II, but for the most part, I can't. I appreciate them as literary works. I appreciate the poetry
mm,
of much of Shakespeare's contemporaries. I don't find the stories or the characters three dimensional or engaging enough for me to care about them on an artistic, like a practice level. But with
hmm
restoration drama, what I love about it is that you have characters who are using language as like pepper spray to keep people at arm's distance because they are so afraid of anyone finding out that they have emotions. And that really resonates with me. And
that's
so
great. I love that.
it's like taking the principle of Beatrice and Benedict and their sparring, and it's making entire plays about it. But it is still heightened text. It may not be verse, but it is still, for the most part, very heightened, very stylistic. And yet, I think that in every Restoration comedy, there comes a moment when you hear the scared little kids underneath these elegant courtiers, these scared kids whose parents were cruel to them, going, "Please don't hurt me. Please, please, please don't hurt me. I'm scared."
Oh my gosh.
And but there are people doing beautiful, poetical, heightened language plays today as well. I mean, Naomi Azuki, for instance, I read her Anonymous, and I was like, this is like liquid silver. This is poetry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to speak it, I think would carry an actor to the verge of sort of, full emotional surrender in a way that Shakespeare kind of invites us to. And I don't know about you, but I know sometimes when I speak his text, I find that emotions I didn't even know were bubbling end up rising to the surface. When I played Isabella in Measure for Measure, I remember one day in rehearsal, I got to her monologue to Angelo in 2-2, like the one about Jove. I'm not gonna be able to do it off the cuff right now, but could great men thunder as Jove himself does? Jove would ne'er be quiet. That one.
Yeah.
And I reached the fever pitch of that monologue, which comes like 12 lines in, and I felt like myself starting to cry. And it was just because I was sensing her fervor, her zeal, so fully, and her sort of commitment to God and her love of grace and her love of mercy so deeply that it was like bringing me, the actor, to tears, because the language was like sweeping me there,
Absolutely. And I think, everyone, really letting yourself be swept away in that, it shows that you're meeting the language halfway.
Right.
It's not doing all the work for you. You're coming to the table with what you have, your whole open body, spirit, emotional being, and the language picks you up and carries you the rest of the way.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about working with Shakespeare is that characters in those worlds, in those plays, their speech is their thought. Mm-hmm. There's so little of a filter. It's just, right. I think, I feel, I speak.
Yeah, and totally.
I think that it's great that nowadays we edit ourselves a little bit. I think it's important. Sure. I think it's helpful to have, maybe I shouldn't say the first thing that comes into my head, but everyone deserves to be in a space where they can see what that feels like.
Yeah.
And working on the plays, working on that language is just such a great way to connect to that. Yeah. And you don't have to be an actor to do that.
No, you don't.
That's just a personal thing. Yeah.
I mean, Romeo and Juliet as characters get a lot of flack for being dumb kids. But you know what? Speaking from experience, it takes a lot of courage to tell someone you love them. Like that takes guts. And bless those young people for just doing it fearlessly and boldly, and with absolutely no guarantee that it's going to be reciprocated. They just say it. And there is courage in that I would take over the courage of entire armies,
Yeah.
So we're at about the halfway mark. So I just want to take a moment to thank some of the people who have enabled us to have this wonderful conversation today. So big shout out and thank you to the Arts Council of Fayetteville and Cumberland County. Thank you for investing in Sweet Tea Shakespeare and in the arts communities of North Carolina. We're so grateful to you for supporting us and for enabling us to do this really exciting virtual work that allows us to connect with wonderful artists from all over the country and even outside the country, and to just keep having conversations that make us feel connected and enriched even during this time of quarantine. So thank you so much for allowing us to do this work. And then I also just want to say a big thank you to our artistic director, Jeremy Feebig, and our general manager, Ashanti Bennett, who do more work than is conceivable to the human brain. Thank you so much for investing in me and for supporting me and for sort of helping me create this this series of podcasts, so that I can have wonderful conversations like this one with Wiley. I'm very appreciative. So Wiley, I want to talk about Richard II.
Yeah, Richard II, and let's fuck it, like all the histories.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I love Richard II very, very deeply, but it's my least favorite of the Henriette. Like I don't get fully invested until Hal shows up, so it's for all the love I have for Richard II, it doesn't even measure up to what I feel about 1H4, 2H4, and H5. But I know that you and I are both we're in the pre-gaming mode for Richard II for various productions. So I'd love to hear about the one that you have coming up, the circumstances of that show, and what this dramaturgical period is like for you.
Yeah, sure. So I work with a company called Upstart Crow Collective that is committed to performing classical text with diverse female and non-binary casts. And I've been working with them for the last 4 years or so. Obviously not in an acting capacity at all. No, I've dramaturged, I think, 3 or 4 shows. I assistant directed another, and their work just speaks to me immensely and how I understand Shakespeare. And I think their work moves the conversation around those plays forward, specifically around the accessibility and representation that is always worked for on those stages. So my experience with the history primarily have all been through working on them with casts of women and non-binary folks, and me being the minority in the room, which is another fascinating experience.
Totally.
So it's really interesting because, like, the work of Upstart Crow is one thing, and then the work that we were just doing on this workshop of Richard II felt part of it, but also completely different, because we're trying to conceive how to do Richard II in a time of physical distance.
Right.
Is there a way that this lives online, on screens, is streamed in some way? And I mean, and I can't speak a whole lot to any decisions that were made, because the workshop was very much just an exploratory one. But we talked about a lot of themes, and what themes of this play speak to our current political, social, economic experience. And one of the things that I really appreciated about working with Upstart Crow, specifically those artists that really run the company, are Rosa Josie, Kate Wisniewski, and Betsy Schwartz. One of the things that I learned from them is that when you're talking about history plays, they're not history plays. They're political war plays. They're about politics and war.
Yep.
Those are things that are universal experiences. And immediately shifting that perspective of, this isn't a history play, this is about politics and war, this could be happening right now. Immediately shifted the focus out of, this is something that happened to other people a long time ago, to, whoa, this is happening right now. And I think that's true as well for Shakespeare's audiences, right? Because he's very smart about not writing about the Elizabethan politics. I think there's one overt reference to Essex, right? In Henry V. But other than that, he keeps a buffer zone of either if it's in England, it's at least 100 years ago. At least 100 years, or it's a made-up land. It's in Illyria,
or it's in Italy,
or the Roman Empire, right?
Sure.
It's in Italy. It's in France. It's in the Roman Empire. It's something. It's all these great oblique angles that he's able to focus in on, and tell a story. I was reading some
Stephen
proclamation
Greenblatt.
about
Have you been reading Stephen Greenblatt?
Yes, well, yeah.
Oblique angles. That's what I got in my head.
That's exactly who I was reading. No, he
Yeah.
talks about that there was some proclamation of like you can't depict or imagine
Compass.
the
You can't
deposition
compass
of
the death of a
yeah,
woman.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that phrasing means that the authorities could really pick and choose what they saw to be seditious. So
Sure.
uh, I think in a similar way, he is doing the same thing of using something from the past to illustrate what is going on right now. Um, so yeah, a lot of our conversations around Richard II is uh, how is this play reflective of us in this moment? Now, when we worked on the goal that Upstart Crow has, and this I can say, the goal we have is to work up to a place where we can perform the entire history cycle
I know.
all the way through with a set company of actors and take it to DC and set up a tent on the National Mall
I know.
or right in front of the White House and perform it there. So that's the goal.
You have to get Rosa. You have to get Rosa to let me in, even if I'm just like, I'll just like carry your set. I'll carry props. I just want to
Yo,
be there.
honestly, just show up and you're a part of it. That's what I listen. The way I started working with Upstart Crow is I had heard that this director Rosa Josie in Seattle was this was in 2016 that I reached out to her, and I heard that in 2017 she was going to be putting up a production called Bring Down the House, which was a two-part adaptation of the Henry VI trilogy, and it was going to be performed with a cast, all-female cast. Um, and I was very excited about this. We met for coffee and we had a great time connecting. And I said, I hear that you do not have an assistant on this yet. I would love to work with you. And she said, well, to be honest, I am looking for a young woman to assist me. So give me 2 weeks. I'm going to make some calls. And on the off chance that I cannot find anyone, you are at the top of my young white male list. Uh, so and she was true to her word. She made calls, and the reason why she couldn't find a female assistant is because all the people she asked were already directing something. They already had jobs.
Yeah,
So
sure.
so yeah, for me it was a real win for the white guys. Uh, no, but that ushered in my experience with those shows.
Sure.
Bring Down the House, the Henry VI's. I believe that was actually the first history play that I had ever worked on.
Oh wow. Okay.
I hadn't worked on any other history plays, so my whole view of the world of these plays from like I'd seen other
Sure.
histories
Sure.
before, but from working within them, it was always in a room full of women and non-binary folks,
Hey.
it's been wild. It's given me a really different perspective on a lot of the themes that come into those places, especially like this whole question of divine right,
Yeah.
right to rule. It is my destiny and my right to play this part. This part was written for me. It is my time to play this part versus I'm going to take it. I'm going to take the crown right now. I've spent too many years being wronged, so I'm going to change it. I'm going to write my own destiny. And there's something just very rebellious that I found just being in these rooms and experiencing it with those bodies and those voices up on stage telling those stories.
Yep.
All that to say, tying it back to Richard II, when we were working on Richard III, which of course is at the end of the cycle, the central phrase or question that the central phrase that the whole production was built on is "We are all Richard." We are all Richard.
Wow.
We all possess that same possibility, but also we are all complicit in creating this person.
Yes. Yeah.
Our production was very much, it took its cue from a lot of what Greenblatt talks about in Tyrant of all the enablers, all the different enablers, the way you get to power. So we had this we had this central phrase of "we are all Richard," and now going back to Richard II, we have a similar phrase of it's like Richard is in all of us, or we all reflect Richard. And a lot of the conversation we've been talking about is the way that Richard's journey is a journey of self-discovery.
Yeah, it is.
And so much of his world is everything that's reflected back to him.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of talk about mirrors, mirror images, all the behavior that he does that's reflected back to him. And that when he actually breaks that mirror is when there's a real shift in his character of finding this truer self that that is beneath the title and the exterior and the clothes and the crown, which I think runs through almost all the history plays, right?
Oh, absolutely.
This question of a king,
and
a king.
Well, and Hal's singular soliloquy in Henry V, the one time he is by himself.
Oh,
I know. Trust me, we could talk about that speech all day. But his thing is it's the same recognition as Richard's, except that for him, he's saying, I've known this all along. Because I wasn't born to be the prince. I wasn't born to be the king. So I know better than anyone that it's the objects that people are seeing. That's what they see, the glamour, they see the gildedness of my life. But I know that I'm just an idiot. I know that I'm just a human person who's messy because that's who I was before these things were dumped on me by my father, right? So what he says is like, these objects are arbitrary, and I know this, but I have to pretend that they're not because I have to make it seem authentic to the people looking at me. Yeah. And for Richard, he comes the opposite way. He thinks these things are intrinsic to him, and then he realizes they're not, but the salvation of his story is like, but wait, I'm still a person underneath. I'm still...
Oh my gosh.
There's a person here.
I can... Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I love that word ceremony in that big speech, And what of kings that privates have not too, save ceremony, save idle ceremony. And what art thou?
What are you?
What are you? I love the way that Shakespeare investigates a single word. I'm thinking about ceremony in that speech. I think about commodity in the bastard speech in King John.
Yeah.
And then of course I think about honor in Falstaff's little catechism about what is honor.
Air.
What's a word? It's a word. Yeah, that's man. Those little moments of humanity that pop through, especially in the history plays, those are what get me. Like Hotspur meeting with all his boys, just like, ooh, we're gonna do this rebellion, and he forgot the map.
Yeah,
like damn it, I forgot the map. That's so funny and human, and how could that be history? That's happening right now. So yeah, I mean, dramaturgically, it's an interesting question. Whoa, there we go. Sorry about that.
That was an adventure.
That was a total adventure. Dramaturgically, there's an interesting question of how much of the work of all the history and knowledge feeds into this story that we're telling right now.
Yep.
This question came up in Richard II. The whole question of Gloucester's death, this initial conflict
that we don't see.
We don't see, and I was just learning that there's a play called Woodstock.
Yep.
That's by an anonymous author. That's like, it depicts that. Fascinating. But yeah, we don't see it, and we only, especially, I think anytime you're watching a Shakespeare, especially if you're not as familiar with the story, 2 scenes, 15 minutes or 2 scenes it takes for you to actually start understanding the language. So
that's what Heitner says. He's like 15 minutes in. He's like, if I don't understand it 15 minutes in, I'm not going to understand anything that happens.
Exactly. Which means like to top load. I think about the beginnings of so many of these plays are really all about setting up the exposition of this is what's going on in this world.
Sure.
And that whole Gloucester's death, it kind of stays at the periphery of the action, but that's always constant question, because as soon as Bolingbroke has gone into power, he immediately opens up another investigation into, let's talk about that. But we were talking about, like, how important is it? Obviously, the actors need to know the givens, but
sure.
like, how important is it that the audience follows us? What is an audience's understanding of what this conflict is? And how can we help them towards the story we're telling versus filling in history that an Elizabethan audience would know about the past?
Yep.
It's such a fascinating balance, which goes to say, like, again, it's all about bringing these plays to us now. It's feeling that dramaturgically, yes, it was written in 1550, 1594.
Yeah.
Written in 1594, set in 1399, and we're performing it in 2020. Where those are three very different timelines.
Right.
What's the intersection between those three timelines that we can make a story that really that grounds the audience in the world and takes them on this journey with us? And I think it's always, you're always working with those timelines when you're working on Shakespeare, but especially with the histories. It's always what's relevant to us now.
Yep. Absolutely.
And I know one of the things that Rosa's talked a lot about is, as a director, she's always asking, what does leadership look like? What do we want from leadership? What do we get from leadership?
Yep.
What are we willing to forgive? And what are the things that we will never forget?
Yeah, and and where's the disparity between what they promise and what they deliver?
Yes, absolutely.
Was something we talked. I heard that talked about a lot in the rooms at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for Bring Down the House. There was this question of, like, what are these characters? What are these lords jockeying for power, jockeying for the throne, saying that they're going to do for the people, and what are they actually doing?
Absolutely.
And the gulf between those things is just, like, potently relevant today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think I especially feel it today in our current political movement of, like, the people, our voice has power and impact. It should.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a possibility that it can. I mean, I was thinking about the elections that just happened this past Tuesday.
Yep.
And specifically about, like, the ones that I was really focused on was in New York and Kentucky. And I mean, specifically with that Kentucky one, that the national eye shifted onto a primary election in this state that's pretty deeply red. But suddenly there was this intense surge from everyone looking to see what happened. And connecting it back to these plays, I mean, we're in a world where divine right is sort of a given of the land, but within that, there's all these questions and challenges coming from upstarts all over the place, and that there's always a potential. The potential for leadership can be found anywhere. And then on the darker side, it's when that potential for change completely shifts to being for personal gain. I'm specifically thinking about about Henry VI and that whole trilogy, right?
Yep.
The political turns personal. You use politics as a personal vehicle to get to further my own agenda. And when that happens, the country is the one that suffers.
Yeah. And I think Shakespeare was pretty clear-sighted about that. I mean, it's not that his plays aren't often quite ambiguous, including the history plays. And as you say, he's very clever about deflecting the implications off of his present moment for reasons of self-preservation, obviously. But I think that I don't think he glorifies any of his power-hungry, like, tyrants. That's what's really interesting.
No.
The characters in the plays often do, and if in the case of Richard II, he often does it about himself. There's self-aggrandizing that happens. There's characters like filling each other full of hot air.
Yes.
And yet the fact that the country suffers and that often the most vulnerable and disenfranchised people suffer when these power struggles unfold, I think he's pretty on the nose about that. I mean, I think of the end of Henry IV Part 2, and the last thing we see really of like the Eastcheap crowd in that play, or at least of the Eastcheap Tavern, is Quickly and Doll getting dragged away by these hulking male, policemen to prison. That's the last thing we see there, and it's this little tiny scene, and it's just sort of tucked right before the big coronation scene, and it is this like I don't know. I think it's a very direct reminder of, hey, look at who's suffering right now. Look at who is actually bearing the consequence of this changeover. Like, yes, we want the guy that we knew as Hal to be a good leader, but like, look at what it means. It's women. It's two poor, low-born women that are being literally like brought low by the turning of the tide.
Yeah. And throughout all those history plays, I love that he gives us moments to check in with what do people think of this? Right. Like in Richard II, it's the gardeners. It's just three gardeners just going, woo, this is not looking good for this guy. I mean, kind of ruined the whole thing. And then, there's that the whole connection with Eastcheap and Falstaff, who I feel is kind of a champion of that perspective, right? Totally. He's kind of he's out for himself and his friends and trying to make a buck. And then when it comes to Henry V, you get that beautiful moment with the soldiers, with Williams and Bates. Some of the most beautiful poetry is in the just prose. Around a campfire. More prose. Absolutely beautiful. The more prose and also when prose can be poetic. Yes. That it happens right. He gives some of the most profound views of the world to soldiers, to just common soldiers in that play. And then in Henry VI, that the moment with the father and the son, when they realize that one has killed the other, is just not many of the characters have real moments of like personal reflection like that. Other than Henry, of course. Henry it's right after his molehill scene. Yeah. And then in Richard III, I think about, and this scene I realize is almost always cut, but it's the scene between the citizens. It's the citizens like, what's up, neighbor? You're kind of, what, did you hear the news? We are always
and
getting...
And Scrivener. I think the Scrivener from Richard III, which is also always cut. The Scrivener who runs in...
Who is so blind that cannot see this palpable device. Yeah. That's, man, Scrivener. And it's interesting, when we were doing Richard the Third, that was like late 2018. And, even as I say it, because I remember there was something that Trump had done that was very much like, did anyone else just see that? Yeah. Who is so blind that cannot see this palpable device? And it was interesting. The dramaturgy for that was very much, let's look at dictators around the world and track how they came to power, and let's pull things from our media. Now, I will also say, when we were doing that play, Richard was never Trump in our minds. We tried. It was never like a one-to-one thing, because that doesn't make sense for that play, because Richard is self-aware in a way that but again, this thing of like the complicity, we all made this happen, all our parts. And especially, as we think about the conversation now, as we all as white folks especially reflect on and understand our part in white supremacy, this feeling of like we are all complicit in this. That's a scary place to sit in, but it's a necessary journey that we got to go on in order to affect any form of change. Yeah.
This isn't this isn't entirely related, but it's been on my mind because I've been in playwriting mode a lot this spring during shutdown, and I wrote a stage adaptation of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, and
Yes.
and I included a soliloquy for Napoleon that isn't in the book, and I just wrote it, and it crops up in part 2 after just after he's taken Moscow, and he basically throws a hissy fit. He just comes on stage. We've seen him before. We've heard him talk before, but we don't really feel like we know him. It doesn't really matter if we know him because he's so ancillary to like what's really happening in War and Peace. It's all about the Russian characters, many of whom don't even see the battlefield. But I wrote it without thinking. It wasn't like a planned thing. I was just like, this is when Napoleon comes out. And what I wanted to do was it wasn't just to make a political statement, although it's also that. I really wanted to drive home how the loyalty that Napoleon's invasion was actually engendering in the Russian peasants was misplaced. Because we have a scene, Tolstoy gives us a scene where the peasants refuse to flee as the French are invading. They refuse to flee their town and move further east. Because they think the French are going to liberate them. They're like, look, the French had a revolution. The French killed all of the oppressive nobles. That's what they're going to do here, right? Like, they're going to take care of us. They're going to give us land and grain. Like, we're going to be taken care of. Like, we don't want to give you our horses so that you can flee east. Like, we want to stay here and wait for the French to chop off your heads and give land and rights to us. And what actually happened, of course, was that the French, under Napoleon's orders, Napoleon who had once championed, the progress of the revolution, they just came and burned everything. Just came and slaughtered everyone. You know what I mean? Like, they didn't, regardless of rank, regardless of how wealthy you were, everyone died. Everyone died and everything was taken by the French government. Nothing was redistributed to the people. It was just an invasion. It was just an invasion by a tyrant. But these French peasants who had heard, these Russian peasants who had heard the stories of the revolution, they were like, this is our chance. And so I wanted to be very clear. I wanted Napoleon to have a moment where he came out and articulated that for the audience, because of course you can't show towns burning on stage. That's a harder thing to conjure. But I did want the audience to see the figure that these Russian peasants, who were very understandably fed up with their current paradigm, I wanted to shine a spotlight on the reality of the man that they were throwing their support behind, you know? Yeah. Absolutely. And that makes me...
That's wonderful.
And I think that it was the influence of the history plays. I look back on it now and I'm like, I think it's because I've always been so drenched in history plays that's where that impulse came from.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, that sounds so... I'm so excited to read that adaptation.
I'm excited for you to read it. I'm very nervous for you to read it, but I can't hear what you think. So do you have, it's a hard question, but do you have a favorite Shakespeare play / do you have like a dream production for it?
Sure. Favorite is Twelfth Night.
Great.
I'll stand by that.
Awesome.
Favorite's Twelfth Night. And I think a reason for that is, partially, it was the first one that I ever had any experience with. I was 7 years old, and my dad had seen a production at Lincoln Center. I think it was in 1990. It was around 1997 or something. It was with Helen Hunt and Paul Rudd.
Oh, that was that
one.
Was
Orsino. That was that one with the pools of water on stage. And my dad saw it, and he had such a good time. And he came back, and he took the little like action figures, and he told the story to me with the little figures of it. Like, okay, so this is Sebastian, and this is and he told the story. So that'll always be always my favorite. Ones that I'd like to do a production of. Let's see. There's a Macbeth that I'm really interested in. That is I like specifically from like a design. I love small cast Shakespeare's. I love 4 to 7 actors playing a bunch of different
Sure.
parts. So I'm interested to see what you can find out with Macbeth. It does feel like a ritual. Um, this Hamlet that I'm working on with my friend Meme
Yep.
Garcia, they um, their view on Hamlet is that it's a ghost story. Hamlet's a ghost story,
Okay.
and I'm interested in what that brings us as we tell this play like a ghost story. I'm interested in what that does,
Okay.
and then any others. Yeah, those are the ones that really are sticking to my mind at the moment.
That's great.
Yeah. What about you?
Oh, I have I have so many. I have too many.
So many,
I
too many, too.
no, I have always wanted to do Love's Labor's site specifically in a library. Um,
Oh,
preferably a library on a really let us say elite college campus, you know?
yep,
And
yep.
I want to begin and end it with Jacquinetta just shelving books. And I want the whole thing to be focalized through her. She is watching these prep school Kens and Barbies just, wreck the library. And who has to clean it up? Her. You know?
Yep,
So LLL in
absolutely.
a library. I've also
I will tell thee wonders with that
with
face.
that face, yeah.
With that
I
face.
feel like she gets hit on by like students, TAs, and teachers all alike, and
Oh
she's
yeah,
just
oh
trying to
yeah.
do her part-time job so that she can make,
Trying to
you know,
do my job.
just trying to do her job. The only Macros I've ever wanted to do is Southern Gothic, where the witches are
Ah,
where the witches are dead children, and one of the witches is the dead child of the Mackers themselves.
ooh.
And yeah, and the whole thing is, I see the whole thing as like kind of like a revenge story
Hmm.
by these dead children.
These dead children.
And I mean, obviously, like, I'm so excited to do Richard II this winter because it's kicking off the Henriade. And basically all I want to do with my life is just direct the
Absolutely.
Henriade. I'll just do it over
Just
and over
working
again.
through them one after a time. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh
Oh
yeah.
God, I love them so much. For me, it's not so much like, do I have a production concept per se, but my only interest is like, how do I make it to American politics right now? That's all I care
Yeah.
about. So
Yeah.
I think what that will mean for Richard and probably for the rest of the Henriade as well is men in suits. Not so much because I don't want, it's not that like women, I want women on stage, I want sort of gender parity and I want diverse
Oh
casting as
sure,
much as
sure.
possible, but like I don't want the doublet and hose getting in the way of the audience realizing that these political war plays are about the issues and injustices that we still have not solved all these years later, and they are still being played out on our national stage. So with Richard II, for instance, there's this question of like performative masculinity. So what kind of masculinity do powerful rich men throw their lot behind? Well, they throw it behind the one that looks socially acceptable, which is machismo and like physical power and prowess and sort of grunt, brusque language and like sort of a lack of like no poetry, no emotional frills or expression, like this kind of stoic, stern, martial power. That is the kind of masculinity that they will support, right?
Oh, fascinating.
And then when you sort of move into the Henriade, like I'm interested in fathers and sons and the pressure that is put on children by their parents and and how toxic masculinity perpetuates itself, especially when you have men in positions of power. So that's my interest sort of there. But also like I'm also just interested in what the cost of the turning of the tides is to the people who were never going to have power at all, the people who have been shut out of the system. I'm interested in how they suffer. I mean, I think the soldiers that talked to Hal the night before the Battle of Agincourt, John Bates and Michael Williams, like to me, they are the heart of that play. The play doesn't work without them, and the play, I wouldn't like it if that scene didn't exist. I couldn't like it.
Yeah.
As much as I love him, as much as I love that character, I wouldn't be able to find my way in if it weren't for that moment. Because I think when Hal hears when he hears Williams doing the kind of quasi World War I prose poem about, you know, all the heads and limbs chopped off and like, you know, just the horrors of war, basically. It's horrific language, but it's also quite poetical. And the only other person in the Henriade who can be so poetical with prose is Hal himself. When we hear him Falstaff, you know, the sun, the fair hot wench in flame-colored taffeta, like he makes poetry. He puts poetry into his prose, and then he meets Michael Williams, and Michael Williams is doing the same thing, but turning the rhetoric of the war against him.
When we worked on Henry V, we talked about that scene, that it's in that scene and the soliloquy that follows it where Hal figures out what he's going to say during the speech of St. Crispin's Day.
Yep.
That he doesn't know how he's going to do it, but it's through listening to those guys and having that moment of self-reflection that he figures out, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah.
That's how I read it as well. So
I love that. That's
and
wonderful.
you worked on the one that was at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, the one that like rocked the world and changed my life. Yeah, that was you. You and Rosa.
I was the assistant director on that. It was a wonderful experience. Yeah, that was a beautiful production. Really thankful to have been a part of that.
So good. It was and then you came back the next year and you worked with Jessica Coe again on As You Like It.
As You Like It.
As
You Like It. Yeah. That and then right on into All's Well and Mackers for the last part of that, for the summer openings of that season. Yeah, that was a time.
Yeah, you did a lot that year.
It was a lot, and you know, it was wild. I'm so happy that you got to see a bit of what we were working on with Bring Down the House at the beginning of this year, and I'm so sad that it won't be shared with the world. And I know that like another version of it at some point will arise, and it will get a third life.
Yeah.
But that was a blow to go through that whole journey and then not be able to see it through. That was tough.
Yep. Yeah. I was devastated I didn't get to witness the full thing, but I'm so grateful I got to see the work in the rehearsal rooms. That was extraordinary.
And I think it's important for the folks who, you know, were in those rooms. Remember that it did happen. It didn't just happen in a void.
Yeah.
It happened and it mattered because, you know, we were there and it meant something to everyone who was there. And that does count for something in a creative act. It had an impact that I think actually was a lot larger. Obviously not as large as it would have been had it run for 8 months, but it had an impact that I think is still being felt.
I think that's absolutely true, and I'm sure that we'll sort of circle back to it when I interview Rosa, because I'm hoping she's going to be on the show soon too.
Oh, wonderful!
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to have you talk with her about that. That sounds great.
Well, Wiley, thank you so much for coming on the show with me today. It's been so fun talking to you.
Thank you. It flew by. It was such a great time. Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you, Sweet Tea Shakespeare.
Yes, thank you so much. I am going to